Hey y'all, welcome back to the lab. In this video, we're talking about why Amazon is enforcing a 5-day return to office policy, according to a former AWS engineer. And so Amazon announced this week that they are enforcing a more strict return to office policy, also known as RTO, with a mandatory 5 days a week in office. They join a growing number of tech companies who are ditching the flexible work from anywhere arrangements popular during the COVID era in favor of more face-to-face time in hub workplaces. Now, in this post, we'll explore what the new Amazon RTO policy is, why they say they're implementing it, and discuss whether that actually makes sense or not, pulling from opinions from the industry and a former AWS employee. First, let's start off with Amazon's new RTO policy and what exactly it says. Amazon CEO Andy Jassy released a memo detailing sweeping changes to their working policy. Link to this memo is here. And the highlights are basically this. Return to office is 5 days a week, and they want to increase the ratio of individual contributors to managers by 15% by Q1 of 2025. And that's really all it says in the full memo. Pretty wordy, to be honest. Now, why did Amazon change their RTO policy? So Amazon says the reason that they're making these changes is, one, to increase speed and ownership, which they're saying is the reason behind the IC to manager ratio change. And two is to increase invention, collaboration, and culture. And this is what is moving to the RTO 5 days a week. And these are pretty common reasons. This is something that, Meta said that they were doing by reducing the, levels that they have. Less managers, more workers. Elon says this like all the time for Twitter, Tesla, SpaceX, stuff like that. And then this is like probably the most common reason why people say that they're doing RTO, which we'll talk a little bit about in a minute. Now, they say that their experience with 3-day RTO, which they've done for the past year-ish, has given them confidence that more days in office is better for the company. And I think this is just a little signaling that they're having to try and show that this thing is data-driven. But as we'll see, no company has ever really released data on this, which is an interesting juxtaposition, I think. So is this really why Amazon is moving to RTO? So I've written extensively about why most companies' claims about RTO improving collaboration, culture, and productivity are false. Now, whether that's intentionally false or simply misguided is still up in the air, and an exercise that I'll leave to you, the reader, to come to a conclusion on. Now, former AWS employee John McBride wrote an interesting thread on X giving his take on why Amazon is moving to RTO, and it has nothing to do with culture or collaboration. I find this thread pretty interesting, both in the kind of arguments it presents, but also the ensuing discussion. And so we'll give a little bit of context on this, pulling from that. And so here's his take. Basically, the layoffs in 2022 and 2023 were largely about economic. Many tech companies increased their headcount by 2 to 3x in 2020 to 2022, but later realized that they'd overreached. Revenue wasn't keeping up with costs. And the reason that they did this really was because in 2020, everyone went online. And so usage of social networks went up, subscriptions to Zoom and Slack and all of this stuff really boosted a lot because everyone was online quite a lot more. But by 2022, really people were starting to leave their house more, and so they just weren't online as much. And so that's when they saw all of these kind of revenue spikes that they were kind of trending on go back to quote unquote normal. And so that's when they knew they overreached. And so what they did is to, institute mass layoffs to right size themselves. This one I think is relatively reasonable for a lot of these companies doing these layoffs. Now, some of them had the most largest profits they've ever had, and I don't think that was necessarily as reasonable. But that's outside the scope of this post. Now, what they also did, which is a little bit more insidious, I think, is they utilized RTO as a way to force employees into voluntarily resigning. They're like, oh, you're going to go into 3 days per week. And it's like, well, I moved to another state, and I've been living there for a year. I'm not going to go RTO. And so they can get a lot of people to voluntarily resign. And this has a lot of benefits, right? So the first is it reduces their ongoing costs, which is their whole goal in the layoffs themselves. But because they voluntarily resigned, they also get some extra things, right? They save on the layoff money. A lot of companies pay out severance, so they don't have to pay severance if you voluntarily resign. And they take a smaller PR hit, all these companies were laying off all these people, but that reduced a lot of morale, both at the company and people that are thinking about joining the company. It was bad. And so by, having a lot of people voluntarily resign, they can reduce the numbers that they're displaying in their layoffs, even though they basically did that just in another fashion. Now, interestingly, these reduced ongoing costs did lead to better earnings reports, and thus led to some of the soaring stock prices that we've seen in the past few years. Like if you look at like Amazon, Meta, they're either at or above where they were even at 2022 and when the stocks were the highest. And so this definitely worked out well for them. And so basically, John's take is that this round of RTO enforcement is largely following the same playbook. And moreover, it looks good for the massive tax breaks that they get for having offices in different cities. And so it follows the same playbook, but it still plays nice with the municipalities that are giving these large tax breaks that, may or may not actually be worth it. Now, I think that the ensuing discussion also had some interesting things. So I'm just going to go over these because I think they provide interesting context from the industry and other things that are kind of at play currently and in big tech. The first is that the tax implications may be even higher when you consider Section 174, which is basically the tax law that makes it so you can't deduct tech employee salary as a tax deduction. Instead, you have to amortize it over a 5-year period, which has sweeping issues for like ongoing costs of a tech employee. And I think this means that, each employee has a longer tail of costs, aka really you don't get to deduct it for whole 5 years. And so cutting them sooner rather than later may have long-term benefits, and this might be incentivizing a lot of these companies to try and cut their workforce. Another one is that Amazon is actually getting really large tax breaks from different municipalities for their offices. And so the incentive to like still play nice and be in their good graces is pretty large. And I feel like this is a driving force behind a lot of companies' RTO, even though they won't say it. And just for example, like they're getting about $770 million from Virginia and $3 billion from New York. So that's like quite a lot of money that they can save this way. Another interesting thing is that AWS's margins are pretty high, reported to be around 40%. So even with the recent trend of moving from public to self-hosted clouds, it seems unlikely that AWS's margins or earnings are the driving force behind this. A lot of people were saying that actually it's because AWS wasn't doing so well, but actually AWS seems to be doing pretty great, all things considered. And so instead, it may be more macro effects with Amazon's overall margins, which are closer to 3 to 9% over the 2022 to 24 period. So it's unlikely, everyone moving to Coolify and VPS is the cause of this. And one final thing to note is that a lot of people are saying that, these RTO policies may drive away more senior employees who have more options and value flexibility. But one thing that a lot of people note is that these policies are actually very selective. And so they're not really blanket policies, and often they don't apply to high performers. And so it makes you wonder, like, what are these RTO policies actually for if they are selectively being applied? And so even though they probably will lose a decent amount of their workforce, which is, probably the goal here anyway, it is possible that it'll have a limited impact on their senior workforce because they could just say it doesn't apply to you. Next. So we don't know for sure why Amazon is moving to an RTO 5 days a week. And honestly, we may never know until some of their like C-suite people write their, biography of their life and spill all their secrets. But I think a lot of these hypotheses provide interesting context and food for thought about this change. Now, what is clear is that this RTO trend is widespread, and the popular claims around collaboration and productivity don't seem to hold water. So something is driving this, we're just not sure what. Now, if you like this post, you might also like how return to office policies kill productivity for software engineers and how to salvage it. If you're interested in the current trend of public cloud to private cloud, you might be interested in why Zig is migrating from AWS to self-hosted. And if you're just interested in software engineering and careers in general, you might be interested in how to find fulfilling work as a software engineer and achieve more impact with less stress. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.